disbelief when watching a film. Any film is utterly essential if you want to enjoy it. Some pictures make this easier to do than others, however. Even in films where every effort is made to make something as immersive as possible, there can be small and sometimes large details that slip through the cracks and pull the audience right back down to earth. Recent years have seen absolutely no change in this regard. In spite of the advances in technology and just about every other aspect of the filmmaking process, there are still things brought to the screen that clearly don't belong, whether intentional or not. So with that in mind, I'm Ellie for What Culture, and here are 10 weirdly distracting moments in recent movies. Number 10. Every single song. Joker Folie à Deux. Particularly following on from the wild and unprecedented success of Joker in 2019, to call the sequel a mess would be an insult to messes. Rarely does a franchise go from groundbreaking to laughingstock quite so quickly. Joker Folie à Deux actually had a strong story, revolving around Arthur's internal battles between himself and Joker. It could have made for an interesting premise, but it was buried under an inconsistent tone and director Todd Phillips trying too hard to subvert expectations. Easily the worst part of this was the musical aspect. The question will always be asked: why did the film have to be a musical? Yes, Lady Gaga as Harley Quinn got to show off her awesome pipes in what was a surprisingly good casting, but every single song felt out of place. As soon as there was a moment that could have been rather poignant, deep, or something close to provoking the kind of emotional response that the original film got, Arthur and Lee would ruin it by bursting into song. Subverting expectations is one thing, and certainly no one expected the Joker follow-up to revolve around these musical numbers, but there is a damn good reason for that. Number 9. Getting Lewis Hamilton on screen. F1 the movie. Director Joseph Kosinski moved from making Top Gun Maverick in 2022 to another high-stakes, adrenaline-fueled epic in F1 the movie. Moving from the air to the track saw absolutely no loss in drama or emotion, as the film even drew in audiences that had never cared about the sport before. The races in particular were incredibly immersive, something that was helped by Lewis Hamilton coming on board as a producer and assisting with the realism of the piece. Of course, it came as no surprise that the driver ultimately showed his face on screen. Now, in fairness, there were plenty of F1 drivers who made cameo appearances throughout the movie, as realistically, it would have been impossible to do otherwise. And Hamilton previously turned down an on-screen role in Top Gun Maverick for Kosinski. However, towards the end of F1, there he was. He had no speaking lines, and instead there was just a strange stare down between him and Damson Idris's rookie driver Joshua Pierce. JP then referenced back to it as the two were jostling for first place during the race itself. But this was totally unnecessary. There was more than enough on the line without a shoehorned personal mini rivalry between JP and Hamilton that had literally never been a thing throughout the previous 8 races. Number 8. Geras Mouthpiece, Red 1. Red 1 was a weird film. It was panned by critics but loved by audiences in spite of there clearly being a clash in the tone between a buddy comedy aimed at adults and a Christmas movie aimed at children. This kind of internal battle wasn't the only one Red 1 had with itself, with one scene in particular highlighting the struggle between serious and silly. Said scene saw Callum and Jack interrogating Ted on the beach, before Greela's name was mentioned and she entered the conversation. Kiernan Shipka played the antagonist, and she was painfully underused. She was cold and intimidating as any witch should be, but she was robbed of a lot of her gravitas in the first scene that showed her interacting with the protagonists. When she heard her name, instead of showing herself to Callum and Jack, she instead possessed Ted and spoke through him. A strong show of her powers, sure, and while she was shown giving a chilling speech in her own isolation, the film kept coming back to Nick Kroll reverberating her words. Instead of having the villain intimidate her new rivals face to face, it became incredibly silly thanks to flitting back and forth to Kroll's performance, which was more like nails on a chalkboard compared to Kiernan Shipka's performance. Number 7. The horrific CGI, The Flash. There were a lot of eyes on The Flash when it released not too long after James Gunn was announced as the new head of the DCU in 2022. It played on the multiverse theory, as so many other comic book properties have done recently, and it featured the return of Michael Keaton's iteration of Batman. It's amazing just how disappointing both of these aspects of the film were, and even more so considering that they weren't even the worst part. This honour goes to the horrifically produced CGI fest that looked at previous iterations of the likes of Superman, Supergirl, and The Flash. Not only were likenesses used of actors who have sadly passed, there was an embarrassingly bad computer-generated Nicolas Cage as Clark Kent. The CGI may have been under par throughout the entire film, but it was here that even if audiences had managed to suspend their disbelief up until this point, things were brought crashing back to reality. Honestly, there were so many distracting moments through The Flash, including Barry's tooth falling out in the final scene in the least convincing way possible. But the fan service fest that missed the mark takes the cake. The fact that director Andy Muschietti has been signed on to direct the new DCU's first Batman iteration, The Brave and the Bold, is genuinely worrying for The Dark Knight. Number 6. Morbid jokes in a kids' film, The Wild Robot. When producing a picture generally aimed at younger viewers, it's important to remember that it won't be just kids watching. It is the parents who ultimately decide whether to go and see something or not, and there has to be something in there for them to enjoy as well. That's why in kids' films you'll often see more mature jokes hidden, to give the adults in the room a laugh while sailing right over the heads of the little ones. The Wild Robot was no different in this, though some of the jokes made were surprisingly morbid. The heartwarming story surrounds Roz, the titular robot, growing into the mother figure of a young gosling, Bright Bill. Of course, there was much to learn, and some of this came from a conversation with Catherine O'Hara's Pink Tail, an opossum happy to offer advice on the harsh realities of raising numerous children. Jokes about not enjoying the tougher side of parenting are one thing, but at one point, one of her children gets attacked and apparently killed, to which she has absolutely no reaction. Then, when the little one returns, having actually survived the attack, the mother lets out a sarcastic celebration as if she would have preferred the child to have stayed dead. I mean, this would have been incredibly morbid even if it hadn't been in a kids' movie. Number 5. Jon Voight's Arrow, Megalopolis. The film industry at times can be rather predictable. However, on the other side of that coin are those complete shocks that no one could have ever seen coming. Who would have thought that Francis Ford Coppola, one of the most respected directors of his generation, would make something as divisive and downright bonkers as Megalopolis? The film, completely financed by the director himself, is utterly insane and features more than a few scenes that you could describe as distracting, to say the very least. Even more distracting than a red Make America Great Again hat or Adam Driver breaking the fourth wall was a particular scene involving Jon Voight. The man who played Hamilton Crassus III was bedridden when Wow Platinum and Claudio came to taunt him. He began by asking what they thought of his boner, which could clearly be seen poking up under the bedsheets, before revealing that it was in fact a bow and arrow. He swiftly shot them both in what was an incredibly puzzling scene. The lead up to the reveal of the arrow made the entire thing a laughingstock, and not something anyone would have ever expected from the man behind the likes of The Godfather and Apocalypse Now. Number 4. The Seven Dwarfs, Snow White. Disney's live-action remakes may largely be met with negative reviews, but in terms of box office success, things are a little more hit and miss. However, the 2025 Snow White was successful neither critically nor commercially. The reboot of the beloved 1937 film was panned by critics and failed to cover its reported budget of $240 million at the global box office. There were controversies both off-screen and on-screen, which is something that plagued the picture throughout its entire run. Now, one of the most obvious aspects that audiences didn't connect with was the appearance of the Seven Dwarfs. Following Peter Dinklage's comments criticising how Disney was playing the negative stereotypes, Doc, Grumpy, Happy, Sleepy, Bashful, Sneezy and Dopey were instead created using CGI. And the results were awful. Surely the entire point of these remakes is to bring the stories to life in as realistic a way as possible. This was done by The Lion King, even to the point that any and all personality and emotion were removed from the animals. If that is the aim, then Snow White underwhelmed spectacularly, when it came to the dwarves at least, and if that was not the aim, then why produce a remake in the first place? Number 3. The Alpha Zombie, 28 Years Later. Naturally, revisiting a franchise after so long will come with lots of changes. 28 years later, return to the rage virus-infected UK, well, 28 years later, and the state of said infected was very different indeed. A far cry from the classic shots of zombies sprinting at the likes of Cillian Murphy's Jim and Robert Carlyle's Don. By the time Aaron Taylor-Johnson rocked up, the infected were fat, slow, and couldn't even support their own weight. Most of them, that is. While there were plenty that crawled along the ground eating worms, there was also the Alpha. This was essentially a super zombie who was bigger, stronger, faster, and much harder to kill. They could take more arrows to the body without falling down, and ripped their victim's head off with their spinal cord still intact. They would have been more intimidating than they ultimately were, but there was one thing that detracted from this. Namely, the Alpha that Dr. Kelson called Samson was completely naked, with it being impossible to keep the eye away from what normally would have been covered between the legs. To put it bluntly, things were swinging around far too much for the zombie to be taken as seriously as it should have been. And due to the presence of youngster Alfie Williams on set, a prosthetic had to be worn, which may not have helped it in being so distracting. Number 2, Baboons, Rhinos and Sharks, Gladiator 2. While certain sequels managed to avoid some of the pitfalls of a film releasing decades after the original, Gladiator 2 did not. There was the predictable familial tie back to the original, the striking similarities in plots, and of course, it did everything it could to go bigger and bolder than what came 20 years prior. This was true of the animals involved. While Maximus tussled with tigers in the original movie, Paul Mescal's Lucius found himself going up against baboons, rhinos, and sharks, and the CGI used to bring them to life just didn't fit with the rest of the film. Even a director who prides themselves on practical effects as much as Ridley Scott has to be realistic with what they can achieve. And so there were far more visual effects utilised in Gladiator 2 than in the original. Paul Mescal wasn't about to bite a real baboon, after all, and there certainly weren't going to be any real rhinos or sharks brought onto set. However, even with a huge budget to spend, the effects on the animals looked subpar, to say the least, in particular the baboons. Their screaming and shrieking were reminiscent of something from Van Helsing, which didn't exactly light the world on fire with its outstanding CGI back in 2004. Number 1, Ian Holmes' Rook, Alien Romulus. Gladiator 2 may not have been able to resist tying its sequel back to the original with a surprise familial link, but Alien Romulus did. It would have been the easiest thing in the world to make Rain Ellen Ripley's daughter. But the film went in a different direction, and the character was stronger for it. However, that's not to say that Romulus didn't connect back to the original Alien at all. In fact, the fan service that it did include was worse than a Ripley connection would have been, in that when the group landed on the titular ship, they found a synthetic by the name of Rook who took the exact form of Ash. Ash was played by Ian Holm in the original back in 1979, and although the actor's estate gave permission for his likeness to be used, Romulus would have been better without it. Aside from the moral and ethical questions casting a deceased actor raises, and the backlash Romulus received for it, it was totally unnecessary. This was a strong outing in the franchise without it, and even if it wasn't, the CGI work to make the appearance happen was incredibly poor. Director Fede Alvarez worked to make it better for Romulus's home release, but even now, it doesn't seem as though there was much improvement.